All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. Thanks so much for being with us today. We've been talking about this death penalty stuff, the executions, and we'll continue with that discussion, I'm sure, later in the program. But for now, I want to welcome back to the program. We've got the state director from Americans for Prosperity, Arkansas. Mr. David Ray is on the line. David, welcome back to the program, sir.
Thanks, Paul. Always a pleasure to be here.
We've been doing these things, with legislators called, impression of the session and things like that. And you were down there at the Capitol more so than I was as the state director for Americans for Prosperity, Arkansas. So I'd love for you to give your impression of the session if you'd like. It could be as long or as short as you like.
Okay. Well, Paul, I've heard some of the recaps you've done with legislators, and I tend to agree with a lot of what they've said. I would say that if I were to summarize it, this session was obviously a mixed bag. From a defensive posture, I think we were successful in killing some of the most egregious pieces of legislation. The gas tax bill really sticks out. That would have come with a $200 million a year price tag. And the internet sales tax as well, that would have come with a price tag of a minimum of $100 million, perhaps $150 million per year. It's not clear that issue is dead for good, but at least a temporary victory has been won there. From an offensive posture, there were a few successes. I wouldn't say there were a lot. One of the ones that sticks out was the repeal of prevailing wage requirement in Arkansas, which is a really costly government mandate that drives up the cost of public construction projects needlessly. From a taxing standpoint, the $50 million income tax cuts at the beginning of the session that were targeted at low-income Arkansans, that was not really all that we were hoping for. They were pretty modest in scope. But nevertheless, when you get an opportunity to lower income tax rates on hardworking Arkansans, I think that's a step in the right direction, even if it's a small step. And I know you're not a fan of task forces, but this one I think actually has some pretty strong potential. Now, whether that potential will be realized or not, that one is going to kind of be to be determined. But if this task force can come together and build consensus around reducing income tax rates on individuals, perhaps lowering our corporate tax rate or reducing, even eliminating the franchise tax, any of those things would be, huge wins for the taxpayers and would be well worth the wait. I would say also, there was the bill to phase out the InvestArc tax credit. That is really the state's largest corporate welfare tax credit in our code, and that'll be replaced with the phase out of a business input. So that's a real upgrade to our tax code. But really, there were a lot of missed opportunities, I think, in this session, and that's what really, I think, sticks in the craw of a lot of grassroots types. Obviously, we were heading into this session with hopes for more in the way of tax reform and relief. School choice was something that came up short.
Yeah.
Where there was a huge opportunity to make great strides there, and there just wasn't enough votes in the House. One of the issues that I've been very passionate about, special election reform, came up one vote short in the House. So, and then of course the Medicaid expansion enrollment freeze got out of the House, but then kind of withered on the vine over on the Senate side. So there were really some areas where we came up short, and there were some opportunities missed. So. Yeah. That's what sticks out most to me.
Well, and I'm following along, and for the most part, I agree. My fear on the task force is that the potential you reference. I don't deny that there's potential, but you also reference the missed opportunities that they had. So this session had a lot of potential. And and a lot of it was wasted, and we ended up playing defense. But I do want to talk about one thing. That one of the positives you mentioned, prevailing wage. Tell us about this, because this was a good piece of legislation that is going to save, we hope, taxpayer money.
Yeah, so this is a bill that ended up getting sponsored. This was Senate Bill 601, and it was sponsored in the Senate by Senator Bart Hester from Northwest Arkansas, and also in the House by Austin McCollum, a freshman representative from the Bentonville, Pea Ridge area up there, Buena Vista, that area. And this would essentially some states have a mandate that requires the Department of Labor to commission a survey that determines the quote-unquote prevailing wage, which is essentially the union wage. That's the way it shakes out. And that is the floor for how much the state government pays for construction labor on public works projects. So what that essentially results in is government pays an unnecessary premium on construction labor. So the taxpayers get charged more simply because they're the customer. That's the end result. And we know that states that have repealed their prevailing wage laws have experienced massive savings. You look at when Scott Walker repealed prevailing wage in Wisconsin, or when Mike Pence in Indiana repealed their prevailing wage law. Kentucky, Governor Matt Bevin, they did the same thing there. All these states are experiencing significant savings in the tens of millions of dollars every year.
I mean, it sounds good, and it sounds like something that should have, it's kind of pretty much common sense. And I bet it's going to go over here a lot easier than it did in a place like Wisconsin. I mean, good grief.
Yeah, I mean, it was a politically much easier of a lift here in Arkansas because we don't have very high rates of unionization in our workforce. But ironically, states with really high unionization rates like West Virginia and Kentucky and Indiana and Wisconsin beat us to the punch. So I'm really glad that Arkansas has joined the club there, because this is a significant labor and regulatory reform.
David, you mentioned in your comments $50 million, the tax cut, low income, for those making $21,000 or less. And look, I agree. Anytime we're going to reduce that income tax, I think it's a good thing. I wish we could have done more. I wish it would have been on the job creators and the business owners and tried to free up some of their money. But was it frustrating to you at all to hear the rhetoric from those who said, we're cutting taxes? And it was odd because it was those making $21,000 and less. You had Republicans that could say, we're for this because it's a tax cut. You had Democrats that would say, we're for this because it's a tax cut on the right kind of people, those, who are poor. But then, in the same breath, both Democrats and Republicans supported the internet sales tax, which is going to affect lower income people worse off than it would middle or upper income people. They supported, many of them, the gas tax, and then they supported the tax increase on tires and used tires. And so was that frustrating at all to kind of hear, the rhetoric being we're all for low-income Arkansans one day, but we're going to ignore how these are going to be regressive in the other days?
Well, I'll say, it was a little bit frustrating that this was the extent of the tax relief that we tried to tackle. I think the elephant in the room is Arkansas's uncompetitive 6.9% personal income tax rate. I think that is one of the largest things hampering our state from a competitiveness standpoint with our neighbors, particularly states like Texas and Tennessee that have zero income tax. And our state has basically admitted that that's a serious problem because we give a personal income tax exemption to anyone who lives in the city of Texarkana. If you live in Texarkana, you pay zero income tax. Well, that's not even a tacit admission. That's an overt admission that our current structure is simply not competitive. So that should not have been ignored. As far as what various camps did, I think that the Democrats supported the low-income tax cut proposal because it was, the least. From their perspective, it was the least bad of the tax cut options. And my personal view is that we should cut taxes for everybody: low income, middle income, upper income. And as far as many of the Republicans supporting the internet sales tax and gas tax, that's very unfortunate. And I think that, frankly, most of their constituents won't be pleased to learn that those who cast those votes did. And conversely, I think that those who voted the right way for limited government and things like that, their constituents will be quite pleased.
Yeah, I imagine so, because I think Arkansas at large is a lot more conservative than some of the priorities. What was reflected, I guess, in the General Assembly. I feel like that's pretty obvious. The governor. Go ahead.
One thing, Paul, that I'll say about that is, and I agree with you. Someone on Twitter, I think, quoted Representative Marcus Richmond as saying that reforming state government is like trying to cut down a 300-year-old oak tree with a dull pocket knife. And I think that that's kind of an appropriate analogy. So as I've gotten into the legislative process and my role with AFB, I have been surprised at how difficult change comes and how slowly the wheels of change turn. But I will say this, for all the missed opportunities that we had, I think we're within striking distance of turning a corner in this state. I mean, if you look at the outcomes of a lot of these votes in the House, I think we're probably somewhere between 7 to 10 members in the House from having what I would call a policy majority, where there is an actual governing coalition of conservatives. I'm not referring to people who filed to run with the correct letter by their name. I'm talking about people who have philosophical underpinnings that are related to conservatism and limited government.
So not 76 Republicans, less than that, but enough to where they can get what they want if they stick together.
Absolutely. Look, I think that from my perspective, I'm not really all that concerned with how many R's or D's there are in the legislature. I think what is most important is that there are 50 plus 1 members in each chamber that believe in limited government, believe in lower taxes, less spending, school choice, things of that nature, and that's the point that I think we've got to continue working towards.
I felt like we're talking with David Ray, State Director of Americans for Prosperity, Arkansas. I feel like a lot of my time, and I know a lot of your time, was spent following SB 140, the internet sales tax. And it did get defeated, which it was a surprise. I thought they were going to find a way to get it through, but we now have folks saying, the governor's now quoted as saying, hey, look, we're going to try again. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that I was frustrated with from a learning the process standpoint down in Little Rock this session was that, there comes a point where you just wonder how many times does a bill have to be defeated before it goes away. I've heard you use the analogy that it's like the villain in a horror movie.
Yeah.
No matter how many times it goes down, it just keeps coming back. That's kind of what happened with both the internet sales tax and really the efforts to expunge the vote over and over and over on the gas tax. I think the folks who are really clamoring for the internet sales tax are missing the point. The reason that sales tax collections are down, the rise in internet sales is a factor, sure, but a much, much larger factor is the fact that you go back to the 1950s and you look at the ratio of how we spend our money broken down between goods and services. Back then, we spent about 70% of our money on goods as opposed to 30% on services. Well, now those numbers are flipped. It's 60-40 in the other direction. We spend more money on services, and yet the sales tax largely exempts most services.
Huh. That's very interesting. I actually had never thought of that, and I didn't know that services were sales tax exempt either.
Most of them are. I mean, there are some that are not, and there's really not a lot of rhyme or reason to it. I'll give you one example. The other day I took my dog into the dog spa to get his fingernails clipped because he was starting to tear up the furniture at the house. Well, on that service, I actually had to pay sales tax. But then when I took my dog home, I ran to get a haircut. Human grooming, basically the same category of service as dog grooming, and I did not have to pay sales tax on my haircut. So there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to what's exempt and what's not. And that's really an area that the task force should take a look at, because if we simply broaden the base on our sales tax, we could dramatically lower rates. And I know that some people may look at that as just kind of a tax shift, and it is, but it's a shift in the direction of pro-growth reform, because I think sound principles of tax policy tell us that you want to, whatever you tax more of, you get less, and what you tax less of, you get more. So we want low taxes on work and productivity, i.e. income taxes, and where you have to have some taxes, they should be geared toward consumption.
I certainly agree about that. Well, that's fascinating. I had no idea that the service to product ratio had flipped so drastically. It makes me want to look into it. David Ray from Americans for Prosperity, Arkansas. Great information. I appreciate your input, and you're always welcome on the program.
Hey, thank you, Paul. I appreciate you having me.
All righty. Be safe. Folks, we're going to take a break. The Liberty Machine rolls on next.